I am Valerie, 34, and a senior wealth manager. After 7 years of sacrificing everything to save my family from financial ruin, my mother looked me dead in the eye at Sunday dinner and announced she was leaving the $2.5 million family estate to my golden child sister. My sister had just moved back into the house 5 weeks ago with her unemployed husband. My mother told me my only inheritance was the duty to keep paying their bills. I smiled, handed over my house keys, and walked out. She had no idea I did not just manage the estate, I owned it. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who mistook your sacrifices for weakness. The crystal glass chimed against a silver spoon, cutting through the noise of our Sunday dinner. The mahogany table groaned under candied yams, collard greens, and a honey-glazed ham. My mother Yvonne stood at the head of the table, wearing her signature pearls and an emerald dress. At 62, she ruled our gatherings like a queen, demanding total obedience. She cleared her throat, ensuring every relative looked her way. I have a special announcement regarding the future of this family, Yvonne declared, her voice projecting with practiced elegance. As you all know, maintaining a legacy is the most important thing we can do. We must preserve our generational wealth. That is why I have decided to leave this entire estate to Monique and Preston. A chorus of applause erupted from the relatives. Monique, my 30-year-old sister, tossed her hair and beamed. She reached out to grasp the hand of her husband Preston, a 32-year-old white man who bragged about cryptocurrency investments but never had a dollar to his name. They had shown up on our doorstep 5 weeks ago, claiming their condo was undergoing renovations. I knew they had been evicted, but speaking the truth in Yvonne's house was a sin. Monique is building a beautiful traditional family. Yvonne continued, beaming at her golden child. She and Preston understand the importance of legacy. They are going to give me beautiful grandchildren to fill these halls. She then turned her gaze toward me, sitting quietly at the opposite end of the table. Her warm smile morphed into a thin line of condescension. As for you, Valerie, Yvonne said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. We know you are perfectly content with your career. Since you are 34 and still single without a man or children to distract you, I know you will have plenty of time to continue serving as the family financial manager. Monique and Preston will need your expertise to handle the property taxes and maintenance accounts. It is your duty to make sure your sister is provided for. The relatives murmured their agreement, nodding, as if my mother had just bestowed a great honor upon me. I was expected to finance my sister's lavish lifestyle simply because I was unmarried and successful. Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon. He wore a designer linen shirt and an arrogant smirk that made my skin crawl. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it down the table until it stopped right next to my plate. Since we are talking about finances, Val Preston said, using a nickname I despised. My yacht needs some emergency engine repairs before the summer season kicks off. The bill is $15,000. I told the mechanic to send it directly to you so you can pay it out of the family trust. My assets are tied up in some blockchain investments right now, so I need you to handle this one. Consider it your contribution to the family. Monique giggled, covering her mouth. Honestly, Valerie, you should be grateful we are letting you be involved, she chimed in. Without us, you would just be sitting in your office all alone. I looked down at the absurd repair bill for a boat Preston did not even own outright. Then I looked at my mother, who was nodding approvingly at Preston's audacious demand. For 7 years, I had poured my heart and paycheck into keeping this family afloat. I had swallowed my pride to protect my mother's social image. The sheer entitlement radiating from them was suffocating. They looked at me and saw nothing but a reliable bank account they could drain at their convenience. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. Instead, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a ring holding the master keys to the estate. I placed them gently onto the mahogany table. The sharp clatter silenced the room instantly. Next, I pulled out a thick legal document with a red notary seal and laid it neatly beside the keys. Congratulations, I said, my voice perfectly steady and calm. Yvonne frowned, staring at the items on the table. What is this, Valerie? She demanded, her tone shifting from triumphant to suspicious. What game are you playing? It is not a game. Mom, I replied, smoothing my dress as I stood up. That is the official power of attorney and the keys to this house. Since Monique and Preston are now the sole inheritors of the family legacy, they can take over the financial management immediately. I am officially resigning from my position as your free accountant, Preston scoffed. Do not be dramatic. You are just jealous because your sister has a husband and you have nobody. Just pay the yacht bill and stop making a scene. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked tightly on my mother. I reached into my bag one last time and withdrew a sealed white envelope. I dropped it right on top of the yacht bill. Enjoy the house, I said, offering them a bright and genuine smile. I turned my back on the stunned silence of the dining room and walked out the front door, the crisp evening air hitting my face like a breath of absolute freedom. I walked down the cobblestone driveway to my car. For 7 years, this property had been an anchor dragging me down into a sea of my mother's financial delusions. I unlocked the door and slid into the leather seat. Before I could shift into drive, the front door of the mansion flew open with a violent crash. Yvonne burst onto the porch. Her pinned hair was unraveling, and her emerald dress fluttered wildly as she sprinted toward my car, waving the letter. You cannot be serious, Valerie, she shrieked, her voice cracking of panic I had never heard before. What do you mean you are going to stop paying? She slapped her hand against my passenger side window, her eyes wide with terror. I rolled the window down a fraction, letting her hysterical words spill into my car. The letter she clutched in her trembling hands was not a simple resignation. It was a formal 60-day notice of foreclosure. For 7 years, I had been the silent ghost funding her lifestyle. Every catered Sunday dinner, every donation to her sorority alumni chapter, and every mortgage payment on this $2.5 million house had come directly from my personal bank accounts. She had just publicly transferred the estate to my sister Monique, who did not have a dime. Now the financial lifeline was officially cut. I am very serious, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The estate is entirely Monique's responsibility now. Let us see how far her legacy takes you when the bank demands their money next month. Yvonne gasped, stumbling back. Preston came charging out of the house right behind her. His face flushed red with anger, his loafers slipping on the cobblestone as he sprinted toward my car. He pointed a finger at me, his voice dripping with entitlement used to mask his failures. You get back here right now, he demanded, slapping the hood of my car. You cannot abandon your duties to this family. I am calling my lawyer, Valerie. I will sue you for financial abandonment. I looked at this grown man throwing a tantrum in the driveway of a house he did not own, demanding money he did not earn. It was the epitome of arrogance. He truly believed marrying my sister secured a lifetime ticket to the wealth of a successful black woman. I shifted the car into gear. You should save your lawyer fees, Preston, I said calmly through the cracked window. You are going to need every cent when the eviction notice arrives. Have a lovely evening. I rolled up the window, cutting off his furious shouting, and pressed my foot on the gas. In the rearview mirror, I watched Yvonne weeping into her hands, while Preston kicked the cobblestone in a blind rage. The drive back to the city was quiet and deeply cathartic. For nearly a decade, I had been the scapegoat, the daughter who was never pretty enough, never social enough, never fitting into the perfect mold Yvonne designed for her children. I was the dark-skinned, studious girl who preferred financial ledgers over pageant dresses. Monique was the golden child, the one with the lighter eyes and the perfect charm. My mother treated me like an unfortunate obligation until she realized my knack for numbers could generate serious wealth. As a senior wealth manager, I handled portfolios for some of the most powerful people in the country. Yet my most exhausting client was always my own mother. She drained my resources to maintain her facade among the church elders, always giving the credit to my late father, who left a grand fortune. The truth was, my father left nothing but secrets and massive debts which I quietly absorbed to protect her pride. And how did she repay me by handing the keys of my labor to a sister who never worked a day in her life, and a brother-in-law who saw my family as a quick payday? I pulled into the secure underground garage of my luxury penthouse building. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped into the private elevator, scanning my fingerprint to reach the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering skyline of the city, just the quiet hum of success that I had built with my own two hands. I poured a glass of red wine, setting my handbag on the marble counter. My phone had been vibrating relentlessly since I left the estate. I pulled it out to look at the screen. There were missed calls from Yvonne and texts from Monique, but it was the message from Preston that caught my eye. I opened the message and read his frantic words. "Turn the family credit cards back on right now, Valerie. Monique's card was just declined for our online furniture order. You have no right to freeze our assets. If you do not unlock these accounts immediately, I am calling the police and reporting you for financial theft and embezzlement. You are going to jail." I took a slow sip of my wine. Preston was so entrenched in his delusion of superiority that he honestly believed he could intimidate me. He thought I was just some bookkeeper who had hijacked their generational wealth. He had no idea how tightly I had secured my own assets. I did not type out an emotional response explaining how much I sacrificed for them. Emotional reactions were exactly what they expected from the bitter, lonely sister they fabricated in their minds. Instead, I opened my banking app and navigated to the authorized user management page. The account details clearly showed my name, Valerie, as the primary account holder and sole guarantor of the credit line. Beneath it was Monique's name, listed simply as an authorized user whose privileges had just been permanently revoked. I took a screenshot of this legal proof that every dollar they spent belonged exclusively to me. I attached the image to the chat with Preston and added a brief caption. "It is not embezzlement when the money is mine, Preston. Go ahead and call the police. I am sure they would love to hear why you are trying to steal a black woman's identity to buy your living room sofa." I hit send and watched it deliver. Monday morning arrived with the crisp scent of artisan espresso and the quiet hum of immense wealth. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. We catered exclusively to ultra-high net worth individuals managing portfolios that shaped global markets. The lobby was a sanctuary of Italian marble and imported mahogany, designed to make billionaires feel completely at ease. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly portfolio projection when the unmistakable sound of a grown man throwing a tantrum shattered the peaceful atmosphere. The heavy oak doors of my office usually muffled any outside noise, but Preston was screaming at the top of his lungs. I did not even have to look at the security monitors on my desk to know exactly who was causing the disturbance. The shrill, entitled demands echoing down the corridor belonged entirely to him. I calmly saved my spreadsheet, closed my laptop, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I had anticipated they would try something desperate, but storming my workplace was a new level of reckless behavior. I stepped out of my corner office and walked deliberately toward the reception area. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of my heels, allowing me to observe the scene before they noticed my presence. 2 of our security guards were already flanking the heavy glass doors, looking extremely tense, but maintaining their professional composure. Preston was red in the face, leaning over the reception desk and pointing a finger aggressively at our head receptionist, who looked entirely unbothered by his outburst. Monique stood slightly behind him, clutching her designer handbag, looking simultaneously smug and panicked. She was clearly hoping Preston's aggressive posturing would magically produce a checkbook to fund their lifestyle. "I demand to speak to the managing director right now," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You have a criminal working in this building. She is committing financial fraud. She stole black generational wealth from my wife and her mother." The sheer audacity of this unemployed white man standing in a corporate lobby claiming a black woman had stolen her own family wealth was staggering. He had weaponized his privilege his entire life and assumed it would work effortlessly in my domain. Several of my colleagues had stepped out of their offices, drawn by the unseemly spectacle. Two billionaire clients who were waiting for their morning meetings watched in silent disbelief as Preston paraded his ignorance, demanding to speak to a manager, as if he were arguing over a cold latte at a local coffee shop. He honestly believed his raised voice would intimidate a firm that managed billions of dollars in assets. I signaled the security guards to move closer before I finally spoke. Preston, you are disturbing my colleagues and our clients, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. Preston spun around, his eyes wild with fury. He marched toward me, but the guards immediately stepped in front of him, forming a solid human wall. Get your boss out here, Valerie, he demanded, struggling to look intimidating behind the two broad-shouldered men. You think you can just cut off our accounts and hide in your little office? I am reporting you to the SEC. I am reporting you to the police. You are managing stolen assets, and I will not rest until you are behind bars. I did not react to his volume. I did not flinch or offer any defensive explanations to the surrounding crowd. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew a crisp piece of company letterhead. I stepped slightly to the side of the guards and held it out to him. This is our corporate non-harassment policy, I stated clearly, so everyone in the lobby could hear every single word. Since you are neither a client of this firm nor an invited guest, your presence here is a direct violation of building security protocols. Preston snatched the paper from my hand and crumpled it in his fist. I am not leaving until you restore my wife's access to the family trust. He spat, his chest heaving with exertion. You have a legal obligation to support this family. I laughed. It was a short, cold sound that echoed off the marble walls and made Monique flinch. There is no family trust, Preston. I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. There is only my personal bank account. The exact same bank account you tried to access exactly 1 hour ago at an upscale furniture boutique downtown. The lobby went completely silent. Preston's face paled rapidly, losing its furious red color as his bravado evaporated. Monique gasped, taking a step backward and covering her mouth with her manicured hand. That is right. I continued walking slowly toward him, closing the distance until I was looking directly into his panicked eyes. My fraud department called me at 9 o'clock sharp this morning. They wanted to verify a $22,000 charge for a custom velvet sectional. They flagged the transaction immediately because the black card you handed the cashier did not have your name on it. It did not have your wife's name on it either. It had my name. You tried to use my personal credit card to furnish a house you are currently being evicted from. You gave that card to us? Monique chimed in defensively, trying to salvage her husband's shattered dignity in front of the growing crowd. It belongs to the family, Valerie. Mom said we could use it for absolute necessities. It belongs to me, I corrected her, my eyes locking onto hers. And I canceled it the moment you tried to process that absurd transaction. You committed attempted credit card fraud, Preston. If you do not turn around and walk out of this building right now, I will have the police escort you out in handcuffs and press charges for attempted grand larceny. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but the remaining color drained from his face when I gestured to the guards. Escort them to the street, I ordered, stepping back into the corridor. The guards grabbed Preston firmly by the arms. Stripped of his false authority and backed into a legal corner, he began to thrash and yell, demanding they let him go, screaming that he knew his rights and would sue the firm for physical assault. He looked absolutely ridiculous, dragging his expensive loafers across the pristine marble floor as they physically hauled him toward the elevators. The clients watching the scene murmured quietly to each other, clearly amused by the pathetic and desperate display. Monique did not fight the guards, but she stopped just before the elevator doors opened. She turned to look at me, her eyes narrowed with pure venom. The golden child facade had completely melted away, leaving only bitter desperation and deep-seated entitlement. You think you have won, Valerie? She sneered, her voice trembling with hatred. You think you can just embarrass us and get away with it? Mom is already on the phone. She is calling every single one of her sorority sisters. She is calling the church board, the community council, and every influential family we know. We are going to tell everyone exactly what kind of monster you are and how you abused your own elderly mother to steal her home. By tomorrow morning, your reputation in this city will be completely ruined. Your high society clients will drop you in a heartbeat when they hear what you did to your own blood. Your business is done in this city, Valerie. She stepped into the elevator, her chin held high in false defiance as the doors slid shut, cutting off. Preston's continued shouting. I stood in the quiet lobby, straightening my blazer. Let them call everyone they wanted. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world operated. The fallout from the lobby incident was swift. By Wednesday, the whispers had started circulating through the elite African American social clubs and charity boards my mother held dear. Yvonne spent her days calling sorority sisters, church board members, and wives of prominent city officials. She painted me as the bitter, lonely spinster who had suffered a mental break because my sister found love with a handsome white man. According to Yvonne, I was actively trying to destroy an innocent young couple out of sheer jealousy, using my financial knowledge to freeze their accounts and steal their rightful inheritance. It was perfectly tailored to evoke sympathy for her and disgust for me. The true test of her smear campaign arrived on Friday evening at the annual Sapphire Foundation Gala. It was the most exclusive charity event of the season, gathering the city's most influential Black philanthropists and business leaders. My mother had purchased a premium table months in advance, using my money naturally to showcase Monique and Preston to the community. I arrived alone, wearing a custom-tailored black silk gown that required no validation from anyone. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom, the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Conversations died as I passed. Women I had known since childhood suddenly found their champagne glasses endlessly fascinating. Men who usually greeted me with warm handshakes turned their backs. The ostracization was complete and suffocating. I refused to let them see me sweat. I walked purposefully toward the towering champagne pyramid, taking a glass from a passing waiter. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting an aura of unbothered calm. I knew my mother was watching me from across the room, waiting for me to break. She wanted to see me cower, to see the shame of rejection break my spirit. Instead, I took a slow sip of my drink and admired the floral arrangements, acting as though I were the only person in the room whose opinion mattered. It did not take long for her to lose patience. Yvonne marched across the ballroom floor like a general entering conquered territory. Monique and Preston trailed closely behind her, functioning as her loyal guard. My mother was wearing a dramatic gold gown, her face set in an expression of tragic maternal disappointment, perfectly calibrated for maximum effect. The guests nearby subtly shifted their attention toward us, their conversations pausing entirely as they eagerly waited to witness the climax of the week's most scandalous gossip. You really have no shame, do you, Valerie? My mother said, her voice pitched perfectly to carry over the gentle jazz music. Showing your face here after what you did to your own family. I turned to face her, maintaining my polite expression. Good evening, Mom. The gold looks lovely on you. I hope you are enjoying the event. Do not patronize me, she snapped, her volume increasing, drawing even more eyes. Everyone in this room knows exactly what kind of person you are. You are a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand to see her younger sister happy. You froze your own sister's bank accounts because you are so miserable in your own empty life that you have to destroy a perfect marriage just to feel something. Preston stepped forward, puffing out his chest to look intimidating in his rented tuxedo. You are pathetic, Val. He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Trying to steal generational wealth from a Black mother just because no man wants you. It is disgusting. The crowd around us had grown completely silent. Dozens of people were watching, waiting to see how the disgraced daughter would defend herself against such a public and devastating attack. They expected me to argue, to cry, to try and explain the complex financial reality of our family dynamic. They expected a reality television fight right there by the champagne tower. I did not give them one. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne and looked past my mother's shoulder. I saw the person I had been waiting for all evening walking purposefully toward our small gathering. "You are entirely right about one thing, Mom," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I do not rely on the opinions of the gossips in this room to validate my life. I rely entirely on my results. And speaking of results, I believe there is someone you should meet." The crowd parted respectfully as a tall, striking black woman with natural hair and a brilliantly sharp emerald suit stepped up beside me. This was Elena Rollins, the host of the gala, the founder of the Sapphire Foundation, and a self-made billionaire tech mogul. She was also the single largest client at my wealth management firm. The surrounding guests audibly gasped and stepped back. Elena Rollins was notoriously private and rarely engaged in social drama of any kind. My mother changed her posture, arranging her face into a fawning, socially appropriate smile. "Miss Rollins, what an absolute honor," she began, eagerly extending her hand. "I am Yvonne, and this is my daughter Monique and her husband Preston. We are such admirers of your foundation. Please excuse the disturbance. My eldest daughter here has been going through a severe mental health crisis and has been causing our family unimaginable financial distress." Elena ignored my mother's extended hand entirely, leaving it hovering awkwardly in the air. She looked at Yvonne with a gaze so incredibly cold, it could have frozen the champagne in the glasses nearby. "I am fully aware of who you are," Yvonne Elena said, her voice carrying a quiet, devastating authority. "And I am fully aware of the ridiculous and malicious lies you have been spreading about my primary wealth manager all week long." My mother's smile faltered, her hand slowly dropping back to her side. "I am sorry. There must be some mistake," she stammered, her confidence shattering. "Valerie is just a simple accountant. She does not manage anyone like you." "Valerie is the sole reason this gala is fully funded for the next 10 years, Elena interrupted sharply. "Valerie took my private portfolio and tripled its value in 18 months through aggressive and brilliant market strategies. She is the most competent, trustworthy, and fiercely protective financial mind in this entire city. The fact that you mistake her quiet brilliance for weakness speaks volumes about your own lack of character." The silence in the room was absolute. My mother stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, the color completely draining from her face. Monique stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes, while Preston suddenly looked very small and insignificant in his tuxedo. "I do not tolerate people who attempt to destroy the reputations of the women who build my empire," Elena continued, signaling to the 2 large security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. "You have spent the last 4 days trying to ruin Valerie's business. Consider this your formal eviction from this event and from this foundation." The security guards approached immediately, placing themselves on either side of my mother and Preston. "You cannot do this!" Yvonne gasped, panic finally breaking through her shock as the guards firmly grasped their arms. "I bought a table. I am a respected member of this community. Your table donation has been refunded to whichever credit card you managed to use tonight," Elena said, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. "Please escort them to the street immediately." I watched in profound silence as my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law were publicly marched out of the most prestigious event of the year. The high society gossips who had shunned me 20 minutes ago were now staring at me with a mixture of shock, fear, and newfound respect. I turned back to Elena, raising my glass in a silent toast to our continued success. The morning after the Sapphire Foundation Gala felt entirely different from the rest of my grueling week. The air in my corner office was crisp and cool, and the usual chaotic hum of the financial district far below my window seemed like a distant memory. Elena Rollins had effectively neutralized my mother's vicious smear campaign in a matter of seconds. My phone, which had been ringing endlessly for days, was now completely silent. None of the high society gossips or church board members dared to reach out after watching Yvonne and Preston get publicly escorted out by armed security. I sat at my desk, sipping my black coffee and reviewing international market trends. It was a Tuesday morning, and the world of high finance waited for no one. I was perfectly content to let my mother and sister simmer in their public humiliation. I assumed they would retreat to the estate and lick their wounds. I assumed Preston would finally realize he was completely outmatched and back down. I severely underestimated his absolute desperation. Right around 10 o'clock, a sharp ping echoed from my private terminal. It was not a standard market fluctuation alert or a message from a client. It was a solid red priority notification from the master routing server I used to monitor all the legacy family accounts. When my father Jerome died 7 years ago, he left behind a tangled web of bankruptcies, foreclosures, and empty bank accounts. I had painstakingly consolidated everything, paying off his hidden debts with my own money and grueling 80-hour work weeks just to save my mother from absolute ruin and public disgrace. I kept the old account numbers active but routed all the security protocols and administrative alerts directly to my personal corporate server just to be safe. Now someone was trying to violently breach those ancient accounts. I clicked the notification expanding the security log across my dual monitors. Someone was trying to initiate a wire transfer from a commercial bank account that had been bone dry for nearly a decade. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands as I watched the digital footprints appear on my screen in real time. The IP address belonged to a device located directly inside the family estate. It was Preston. He was frantically trying to reset the administrative security passwords using Monique's maiden name and my late father's highly sensitive social security number. He had somehow convinced my gullible sister to hand over our dead father's personal information so he could go digging for phantom cash. I watched the keystrokes log on my screen one by one as he guessed security question after security question. What was the name of your first pet? What is your mother's maiden name? What street did you grow up on? He was locked out on the first attempt, but he just kept trying with a manic, frantic energy that betrayed his carefully cultivated image of cool wealth. He used a cheap proxy server to mask his location, but my advanced corporate security systems bypassed his amateur trick immediately. It was truly pathetic. He was committing a serious federal crime right from the dining room table of a house I legally owned. He actually thought my father had some secret vault of generational wealth hidden away that I had maliciously kept from them. The sheer arrogance and stupidity of the man was almost fascinating to watch. He tried to route the phantom funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He tried to bypass the two-factor authentication by routing the verification code to Monique's cell phone. He was completely unaware that every single keystroke, every single mouse click, and every single fraudulent entry was triggering a direct fraud alert straight to my desk. I did not block his IP address immediately. I did not shut down the server or lock the portal. I just sat there in the quiet comfort of my office and watched him dig a massive digital grave for himself. He was leaving a trail of evidence so thick and undeniable that a first-year law student could have him indicted by the end of the week. But as I watched his frantic attempts escalate, I began to ask myself a very important question. Why was he doing this? Preston claimed to be a highly successful cryptocurrency investor. He bragged constantly to anyone who would listen about his diverse digital assets, his untraceable wealth, and his luxury yacht. A man with that kind of liquid cash does not spend his Tuesday morning trying to illegally hack into a dead man's checking account for a few $1,000s. It reeked of sheer blind panic. People only take risks like this when they are backed into a dangerous corner with absolutely no way out. My mother had cut me off, and Preston was suddenly realizing the bank of Valerie was permanently closed. The free ride was over, the credit cards were frozen, and the reality of his situation was crashing down around him. He was desperate for liquid cash, and he was willing to commit a felony to get it. A soft knock at my office door pulled me away from the glowing monitors. It was Marcus, the private investigator I kept on a generous retainer for my ultra-high net worth clients. He was a former federal agent who specialized in forensic accounting and deep background checks. He walked in quietly and sat in the leather armchair opposite my desk. He did not say a word or offer a friendly greeting. He just slid a thick, plain manila folder across the polished mahogany surface. I pulled the folder toward me, opened the cover, and began to read the meticulously gathered intelligence. The documents inside painted a horrifying and vivid picture of the man sleeping in my childhood home. Preston was not a crypto entrepreneur. He had absolutely no digital assets. He did not own a yacht or a luxury sports car. The man sitting in my dining room was exactly $800,000 in debt to a syndicate of incredibly dangerous loan sharks operating out of a shadow network in Miami. He had zero income and an eviction history spanning 3 different states. But the final page of the report held the ultimate devastating truth. Preston had deliberately targeted and married Monique solely because public tax records showed she resided at a massive $2.5 million estate. He thought she owned the mansion free and clear, without a single mortgage or lien attached to the deed. He married my sister simply to gain access to what he thought was unencumbered real estate so he could liquidate the property and pay off the violent people who were currently hunting him down. He was a predator who had accidentally trapped himself in a cage with a bankrupted family. I sat in the quiet of my office staring at the final page of the dossier Marcus had left on my desk. The reality of Preston's situation was far more pathetic and dangerous than I had ever imagined. He was a predator who had accidentally trapped himself in a cage with a bankrupted family. He thought he was marrying into a dynasty, but all he got was a mountain of debt and a mother-in-law whose entire existence was built on an illusion of wealth. I could have warned them. I could have picked up my phone and sent the entire file to my sister to save her from the criminal she had tied her life to. But years of therapy and financial discipline had taught me the value of letting people lie in the beds they meticulously made. Warning Monique would only result in another accusation that I was a bitter spinster trying to ruin her fairy tale romance. So I closed the manila folder, locked it in my secure desk drawer, and went back to work. The fallout from my silence arrived exactly 3 days later in the form of a bewildered process server standing in the lobby of my penthouse building. The concierge had buzzed up to inform me that a courier had priority legal documents requiring my direct signature. I instructed them to send the young man up. When the elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, he handed me a stack of papers, nearly 2 inches thick. I thanked him calmly, signed the delivery receipt, and carried the heavy legal bind to my kitchen island. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and began to read the formal complaint. It was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. Yvonne and Monique had officially filed a lawsuit against me in civil court. The primary charges printed in bold black letters were elder financial abuse and breach of fiduciary duty. According to the completely fabricated narrative spun by whatever desperate lawyer Preston had managed to con into taking the case on contingency, I had systematically manipulated my aging mother into signing over control of her vast estate. The lawsuit claimed I had isolated her, restricted her access to her own funds, and abused my position as a wealth manager to siphon her generational wealth into my own private accounts. They were seeking $5 million in punitive damages and the immediate freezing of all my personal and corporate assets. It was a terrifying legal threat designed specifically to ruin a financial professional's career overnight. Any normal wealth manager would be in a state of absolute panic. I just smiled and placed the documents on the marble counter. An hour later, my tablet illuminated with a calendar notification. It was a Zoom meeting invitation sent from Monique's email address with the subject line Family Settlement Discussion. They did not even have the patience to let the legal shock settle before trying to cash in on their intimidation tactics. They wanted to see me sweat. They wanted to watch the arrogant, successful sister beg for mercy. I opened my laptop and deliberately launched my secure screen recording software, ensuring the program captured both audio and video perfectly. I clicked the link to join the meeting. The screen split to show my mother Monique and Preston sitting tightly together on the velvet sofa in the estate living room. The very same sectional Preston had tried to buy with my stolen identity just days prior. They looked incredibly smug. Yvonne had her chin tilted up, projecting the haughty confidence of a queen who had just successfully executed a coup. Monique was practically glowing with vindictive excitement, while Preston tried to look stoic and intimidating with his arms crossed over his chest. I kept my face entirely neutral, giving them nothing but professional indifference. "I see you received our little delivery, Valerie." My mother began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It breaks my heart that it had to come to this. I never wanted to take my own flesh and blood to court, but you left us absolutely no choice. You stole from this family and the law is going to hold you accountable." Preston leaned forward toward the camera, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. The loan sharks were clearly breathing down his neck, and this lawsuit was his only lifeline. "You are looking at federal prison time, Val," he sneered. "Elder abuse is a serious crime. The SEC will strip your licenses the moment this goes public. Your clients will drop you, your firm will collapse, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. But because we are a forgiving family, we are willing to offer you a way out." I sat back in my ergonomic desk chair and let them talk. I wanted every word of their extortion recorded clearly. "What exactly are you offering, Preston?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and curious. Monique took over, eager to deliver the crushing blow she had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror all morning. "We will drop the lawsuit completely, Valerie. We will sign non-disclosure agreements and pretend this ugly mental breakdown of yours never happened. All you have to do is surrender your wealth management firm to us. You will transfer ownership of your corporate entities to Preston, since he has the financial background to manage them properly. You will sign over the title of the estate back to Mom, and you will walk away. We get what is rightfully ours, and you get to stay out of a jail cell. It is a very generous settlement." I looked at the three of them grouped together on the couch. They were so utterly blinded by their own entitlement that they honestly believed they could steal my entire life with a frivolous stack of papers. They thought a fabricated lawsuit would terrify a woman who spent her days navigating the ruthless corridors of high finance. They had no idea that I had already forwarded their complaint to my legal team, who found it so poorly drafted and legally baseless that my senior partner actually laughed out loud on the phone. They did not know I had the forensic accounting proving every single dollar in my accounts was earned by my own labor. And they certainly did not know I was sitting on a private investigator file that could send Preston to prison for fraud before the week was over. I reached forward and adjusted the camera on my laptop, ensuring my calm, smiling face filled their screen. "You are right, Monique," I said softly. "It is incredibly generous of you to offer such a settlement. But I think I prefer to let the legal system handle this one." I reached over and tapped the keyboard, formally accepting the digital summons receipt. "See you in mediation, Mom," I said, my smile widening into something sharp and dangerous. "I hope you bring your checkbook." I ended the call, severing the connection before they could utter a single word in response. The screen went black as the connection severed, leaving my home office in complete silence. I did not panic or call a crisis management team. Instead, I poured myself another glass of sparkling water and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The city sparkled below me, completely unaware of the petty, greedy drama unfolding within its borders. It was time to prepare for mediation. They thought filing a frivolous civil suit would paralyze me. They thought the threat of a public scandal combined with the absurd charge of elder abuse would force me to hand over my life's work just to make them go away. What they did not understand was that high-stakes litigation was the exact arena where I built my entire career. I dealt with hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive hedge fund managers on a daily basis. A baseless lawsuit filed by a desperate white man and a delusional mother was child's play. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents my attorneys had couriered over earlier that morning. The crisp sound of pages turning filled the quiet room as I began signing my name, transferring assets, and executing wire authorizations. I was not just building a defense. I was setting a massive financial trap designed to crush them the moment they thought they had won. I authorized the transfer of the estate's remaining liquid assets into an irrevocable blind trust. I legally severed the final ties between my personal wealth and the property deed Preston was so desperately trying to leverage. My mother had signed over the physical estate to Monique, but the underlying mortgage, the exorbitant property taxes, and the massive umbrella liability insurance were all still held by a holding company I solely controlled. By transferring those obligations into a separate hostile entity, I was effectively dropping a ticking time bomb into their laps. They were demanding $5 million and my wealth management firm. They were about to walk into a legal mediation demanding the keys to an empire while proudly carrying the debt of a sinking ship. My phone vibrated on the desk, pulling my attention away from the complex legal filings. The screen lit up with a string of text messages from an unknown number. I did not need caller ID to know exactly who was contacting me. Preston's desperation had reached a boiling point, and his mask of civility had completely dissolved into pure venom. I picked up the device and read the incoming messages. "You think you are so smart, Valerie. You think sitting in your glass tower makes you untouchable? You need to learn your place. You are nothing but an overgrown accountant who got lucky. People like you are supposed to serve people like me. My family has history and pedigree. You just have an inflated ego and a bad attitude. Hand over the firm and the house before I make sure you never work in this town again. You owe this to my wife and you owe this to me." The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. He was an unemployed grifter, drowning in nearly $1 million of debt to violent criminals. Yet he still had the nerve to speak to me as if I were his subordinate. He actually believed his skin color and his gender gave him inherent authority over a self-made black woman who had outworked him at every single turn. He thought he could intimidate me into submission by invoking some delusional racial and social hierarchy where I existed solely to fund his extravagant failures. It was sickening, but it was also incredibly validating. This was exactly who my mother had chosen over me. This was the perfect interracial marriage she paraded around her high society friends. A man who viewed black women as walking ATM machines, meant to subsidize his mediocrity. My phone chimed again. He was typing furiously, unable to contain his spiraling panic. "We know about the holding company, Valerie. We know you are hiding the estate equity from your mother. Sign it over at mediation, or I will leak everything to the local press. I will tell them you are a hostile, aggressive woman who emotionally abuses her own family. They will believe me. They always believe people like me over people like you. Stop being so arrogant and give us the money." I did not reply. Arguing with a desperate predator was a waste of perfectly good energy, and engaging him would only interrupt his spectacular self-destruction. Instead, I connected my phone to my secure wireless printer. I watched the machine hum to life, spitting out crisp, high-resolution copies of every single text message Preston had just sent me. I printed the timestamps, the threatening language, the borderline racist demands for me to know my place, and the blatant, clumsy attempts at financial extortion. I gathered the warm pages from the printer tray and aligned their edges perfectly. The level of self-sabotage Preston was engaging in was almost poetic. His own contingency lawyers would have an absolute heart attack if they knew he was sending written extortion threats to the defendant just days before a court-mandated mediation. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed to not only destroy their frivolous civil suit, but to invite a full criminal investigation into his own extortion practices. He was too arrogant to realize that text messages were legal documents. I walked over to my filing cabinet and pulled out a heavy-duty red folder. It was the exact bold color of the security notifications that had flashed across my monitors when Preston tried to illegally hack into my dead father's bank accounts. I placed the freshly printed text messages inside the folder, right next to the forensic accounting report from Marcus and the detailed digital access logs proving Preston's cybercrimes. The physical weight of the folder felt satisfying in my hands. It contained enough legal firepower to send Preston to federal prison and leave my mother and sister completely destitute. I closed the cover and ran my hand over the smooth red material. I picked up a thick black marker and wrote a single word across the top of the folder. Checkmate. The calm before the storm was my favorite part of the entire financial game. The pieces were set and the board was locked. My mother and sister were probably spending their weekend picking out designer outfits for the mediation, firmly believing they were about to walk out of that conference room with millions of dollars and a highly profitable wealth management firm. They had no idea they were walking directly into a slaughterhouse of their own making. I placed the red folder into my leather briefcase, snapped the golden clasps shut, and turned off my office lights. The glass doors of the mediation center slid open with a quiet whoosh that felt entirely too peaceful for the absolute massacre I was about to orchestrate. The offices of Sterling and Vance were located on the 42nd floor of a high-rise in the financial district, a firm I retained exclusively for my most aggressive corporate litigation. I walked into the reception area, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. My senior counsel, Arthur Sterling, was already waiting for me. He was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair, a bespoke tailored suit, and the kind of quiet, lethal intelligence that made rival attorneys sweat through their shirts. He did not offer a warm greeting or ask how I was feeling. He simply glanced at the heavy leather briefcase in my hand and gave a single slow nod. We walked down the long corridor toward Conference Room B in perfect, synchronized silence. When Arthur pushed open the heavy oak door, the suffocating smell of cheap cologne and desperate entitlement hit me immediately. Preston was sitting at the center of the long mahogany table, as if he were the patriarch of the family, presiding over a board meeting. Monique sat to his right, clutching a designer handbag I recognized from my own closet. My mother Yvonne sat to his left, already dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. Sitting opposite them was a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a late-night television commercial for personal injury claims. He wore a shiny gray suit that pulled awkwardly at the shoulders, and he was aggressively organizing a stack of poorly printed documents. This was the legal mastermind Preston had hired on contingency. Arthur and I took our seats on the opposite side of the vast table. I did not say hello. I did not offer a polite smile. I simply placed my briefcase on the table and folded my hands, resting them on the cool wood. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and oppressive. Preston, clearly unable to handle the psychological pressure of a quiet room, leaned back in his plush leather chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He was wearing a flashy gold watch that I knew for a fact was a cheap counterfeit. He oozed a toxic mixture of arrogance and absolute panic. "Let us get right to the point." The cheap lawyer began, his voice loud and grating in the refined space. "My clients are here today to offer a generous settlement to avoid the devastating public fallout of a criminal trial. Your client, Valerie, has engaged in a systematic campaign of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and severe emotional distress against her own mother. We have the documentation, we have the witness testimony, and we are prepared to go to court and ensure she loses her licenses, her business, and her freedom." I let my eyes drift from the lawyer to my mother. Yvonne took her cue immediately. She let out a loud, ragged sob, covering her face with her hands. "It breaks my heart," she wailed, her voice trembling with theatrical grief. "I gave you everything, Valerie. I raised you, I sacrificed for you, and you took advantage of an old woman. You locked me out of my own accounts, you treated me like a prisoner in my own home. I just want my house back. I just want my family back." It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. A few years ago, watching my mother cry and accuse me of such heinous things would have crushed my spirit. I would have scrambled to explain myself, to apologize for whatever perceived slight I had committed. Now I just sat there and analyzed the physical mechanics of her fake crying. Her shoulders were shaking, but there were absolutely no tears. Preston leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "The time for playing games is over, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought you could pull one over on two defenseless women, but you forgot that Monique has a husband now. I know exactly how you corporate types operate. You hide assets, you shuffle money around, and you prey on the weak. But I am not weak. You are going to sign over the wealth management firm to me by the end of this hour. You are going to transfer the deed of the estate back into Yvonne's name." And because of the severe emotional toll this has taken on my wife and my mother-in-law, you are going to pay our entire legal fee for this mediation. Every single cent. I remained completely silent. I let the echo of his ridiculous demands hang in the air, allowing the sheer magnitude of his stupidity to settle over the room. He wanted me to pay the legal fees for the lawyer he hired to extort me. He wanted me to hand over a highly regulated financial institution to a man with an eviction record and an $800,000 bounty on his head. He wanted me to surrender an estate that was currently hemorrhaging property taxes and insurance premiums. Monique glared at me, her lips pursed in anger. "Say something, Valerie," she snapped. "Stop sitting there looking down your nose at us. You lost. Just sign the papers and let us get out of here before Preston decides to call the police and have you arrested right now." I did not move a muscle. I simply turned my head slightly to look at Arthur. My lawyer had been sitting perfectly still, his hands steepled under his chin, watching the opposing side with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly stupid species of insect. When I gave him the subtle nod, he slowly reached down and unclasped his sleek black briefcase. The metallic click was the only sound in the room. Arthur reached inside and extracted a single thin manila folder. He did not pull out a massive stack of defense arguments or a counter lawsuit. He did not pull out the red folder I had brought with me. We were not even going to need the cybercrime logs or the extortion texts yet. The foundational truth was enough to end this right here and right now. Arthur casually opened the folder and extracted 2 pieces of crisp white paper. "My client's response to your settlement demands is quite simple," Arthur said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that instantly commanded the entire room. He slid the first piece of paper across the polished mahogany surface, letting it come to a stop directly in front of my mother's grasping hands. It was a certified copy of a death certificate. My father's death certificate. Then Arthur slid the second piece of paper across the table, letting it rest precisely next to the first. It was a multi-page federal document stamped with an official court seal. It was the Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing executed by my late father over 7 years ago. A filing that detailed the absolute liquidation of every single asset, every bank account, and every piece of property tied to the family name. My mother stared down at the documents, her theatrical sobbing dying instantly in her throat. Preston frowned, squinting at the dense legal texts, trying to decipher what he was looking at. Monique just looked confused. "There is no generational wealth," Arthur stated quietly, letting the words drop like heavy stones into the center of the table. "There are no hidden accounts. There is no family fortune for my client to steal. Jerome died completely and utterly bankrupt. The estate you are currently sitting in was foreclosed upon 7 years ago. My client purchased it out of foreclosure with her own money, simply to keep her mother from being thrown onto the street. Every dollar, every asset, and every business you are attempting to extort belongs solely and legally to Valerie. You cannot sue someone for stealing what never existed." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. The silence stretched out so far, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit vibrating in the ceiling above us. Preston's eyes darted frantically across the legal pages. Arthur had slid across the table. He picked up the bankruptcy filing, his hands actually trembling as he scanned the dense paragraphs of absolute financial ruin. Monique was looking back and forth between our mother and Preston, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of pure confusion. She had lived in that massive house her entire life, believing she was the heir to a grand legacy of wealth and prestige. The concept of being completely broke simply did not compute in her shallow mind. The cheap lawyer they had hired sat completely frozen, his eyes wide as he realized his contingency fee was based on a pot of gold that did not exist. He slowly pushed his chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from the sinking ship he had just attached his entire career to. Arthur did not let them recover from the initial shock. He calmly opened another folder and laid out a thick stack of banking ledgers, foreclosure notices, and shadow loan agreements. Jerome did not just die with empty pockets. Arthur continued, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a surgical blade. He died owing exactly $1.5 million to a variety of extremely aggressive creditors, unpaid commercial contractors, and shadow lenders. There were immediate liens placed on everything: the luxury cars, the property, the offshore family accounts. The bank was mere days away from changing the locks on the estate and evicting your mother when my client stepped in. I watched my mother intently as Arthur detailed the exact nightmare I had saved her from. I remembered the crushing physical weight of those days. I was 27 years old, working grueling 80-hour weeks at an entry-level financial firm, sleeping on a bare mattress on the floor of a tiny studio apartment, while I poured every single cent of my salary into paying off my dead father's hidden debts. I negotiated with hostile collections agencies on my lunch breaks. I took on demanding private consulting clients late into the night, just to make the exorbitant insurance premiums on a house I did not even live in. I missed meals, I lost friends, and I sacrificed my entire youth to protect my mother from the ultimate high society humiliation. I did it all to maintain the grand illusion that the Valerie family was still incredibly wealthy. And this frivolous lawsuit was exactly how she chose to repay me. Preston's face lost all its color, shifting rapidly to a sickly shade of pale gray. The reality of his massive miscalculation was crashing down on him in real time, and it was spectacular to witness. He had spent the last 2 years actively courting my sister, buying her expensive dinners on credit, proposing with a massive diamond ring he likely could not afford, all because public tax records showed she resided at a $2.5 million estate. He thought he had successfully secured a wealthy idiot who would blindly sign over the deed to save him from the Miami loan sharks breathing down his neck. He had married Monique solely to liquidate her assets and save his own life. Now, sitting in this sterile corporate conference room, he was finally realizing the devastating truth. Monique owned absolutely nothing. The estate, the cars, the bank accounts, the credit cards. Everything was strictly under my personal corporate control. He had permanently tied himself to a woman who was just as broke and desperate as he was. His ultimate golden ticket was actually a massive mountain of debt, wrapped in a designer dress. Monique shook her head, her perfectly curled hair bouncing around her shoulders in denial. "That is a lie," she stammered, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur. "My father was a financial genius. He was a titan in the industry. He promised me the house for my wedding present. Valerie is just lying to steal it from me, Preston." "Tell them she is lying." Preston ignored his wife completely. He dropped the bankruptcy filing onto the table as if the paper burned his fingers. He looked directly at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine, unfiltered terror in his eyes. The arrogant bravado was gone. The smug male entitlement had completely vanished. He was a cornered animal realizing the trap had already snapped shut around his throat. "There is no money," he whispered almost to himself, his voice cracking. "There is absolutely no money." I expected my mother to feel some level of shame. I expected her to lower her head and apologize for dragging me into a legal mediation to steal the very assets I had bled to build for her. I expected some small ounce of maternal guilt for the sheer audacity of her public betrayal. But Yvonne did not feel shame. She felt cornered and exposed, and when narcissists are cornered, they simply attack. She slammed her hands down hard on the mahogany table, startling her own lawyer. "So what?" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing violently off the glass walls. "So what if you paid off the debts, Valerie? That is exactly what you were supposed to do. You are the smart one. It was your absolute duty to clean up your father's mess." I stared at her, letting her unhinged logic wash over me. My duty. Working myself into the ground to fund her country club lifestyle was somehow my fundamental duty. Yvonne was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate anger. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do not sit there looking at me like you are some kind of innocent martyr, Valerie. You think you are so superior because you have corporate money. But look at you. You are too ugly and too difficult to ever get a husband anyway. No respectable man would ever want to deal with your miserable, rigid attitude. Your only job was to work hard and provide for Monique so she could marry well. She actually said it out loud. The ugly, unspoken truth that had dictated my entire childhood was finally broadcast in a room full of people. I was nothing but the beast of burden. I was the workhorse meant to pull the heavy cart while my beautiful sister sat comfortably inside it. She is the beautiful one. Yvonne continued, her voice cracking with hysterical rage as she gestured wildly toward Monique. She deserves a soft, luxurious life. She deserves the massive house and the money and the endless comfort. You were built for hard labor, Valerie. You were meant to fund this family, not steal from it. How dare you try to keep what you earned when your own sister needs it? You owe us that money. You owe Monique that house. The cheap lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the heavy table and disappear. Even Preston looked entirely shocked by the sheer toxic venom pouring out of his mother-in-law's mouth. Arthur did not flinch. He simply closed his empty briefcase with a soft click and looked at me, waiting patiently for my command. I had brought them here to show them exactly how powerless they were. But my mother had just shown me exactly how deeply she hated me. I looked at my mother for a long, silent moment, letting her vicious words settle into the sterile air of the conference room. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving with the exertion of finally screaming her ugly truth out loud. Monique was looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph, genuinely glad that our mother had finally put the ugly workhorse back in her place. Preston was just sweating, staring at the bankruptcy papers like they were written in a foreign language. The cheap lawyer they had brought along was already quietly sliding his documents back into his battered briefcase, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Arthur sat perfectly still beside me. He knew what was coming next. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. The scraping sound of the chair legs against the floor made the lawyer flinch. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I did not raise my voice or scream back at my mother. Anger was an emotion reserved for people who still cared, and looking at the three of them, I realized I felt absolutely nothing at all. I was completely detached, observing them with the cold precision of a surgeon about to make the final cut. The years of taking their insults, the endless holidays where I was mocked for my appearance, the constant draining of my bank accounts, it all faded away, leaving only this perfect crystalline moment of absolute power. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am the smart one. And because I am the smart one, I knew better than to simply write a check to clear my dead father's name out of some misplaced sense of familial duty. I knew that if I simply paid off his massive debts, you would go right back to living your extravagant lifestyle and completely bankrupt the family a second time. You see, when I worked those grueling 80-hour weeks and lived on instant ramen, I did not just pay the bank to make the debt magically disappear. I walked around the edge of the large mahogany table carrying my leather briefcase. Preston shrank back into his chair as I approached his fake gold watch clinking against the wood. I reached inside and pulled out the red folder, the one I had marked checkmate just a few hours ago. I opened it and extracted a thick, stapled contract, pulling the pages apart so they could all see the heavy corporate seals and authorized signatures. I did not pay off the debt, I explained softly, letting the words sink into their thick skulls. I bought it. As a master wealth manager, I knew exactly how to negotiate with predatory lenders and banks that were eager to offload toxic assets. I formed a private holding company and I purchased every single one of Jerome's promissory notes for pennies on the dollar. I bought the liens on the luxury cars, I bought the debt on the offshore accounts, and most importantly, I bought the primary mortgage on the $2.5 million estate you currently sleep in. Monique's mouth fell open, her lip gloss shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. "But Mom signed the deed over to me," she protested, her voice trembling with the first real edge of panic. "She gave me the house as a wedding gift. It is mine." I looked down at my sister, feeling a brief flicker of genuine pity for how incredibly naive she was. "Mom gave you a piece of paper, Monique," I said. "She transferred the deed subject to the existing mortgage. A mortgage that has not been paid in 7 years. a mortgage that belongs entirely to my holding company. You do not own a dynasty. You own a shell. I am not just the wealth manager you tried to sue today. I am the bank that holds the note to your entire life. I am your landlord. The blood drained completely from Preston's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take over. He tried to open his mouth to speak to formulate some kind of arrogant comeback, but his voice completely failed him. I turned my full attention to him, letting him see that I knew absolutely everything. "You thought you hit the jackpot, Preston," I said, my tone dripping with cold amusement. "You married my sister because you looked at public tax records and saw she resided in a multi-million-dollar mansion. You thought you could liquidate her assets to pay off those dangerous loan sharks hunting you down in Miami." I watched his eyes widen in absolute terror as I mentioned his deepest, darkest secret. "Yes, Preston. I know about the $800,000 you owe to the Shadow Syndicate. I know you have absolutely zero digital assets and a string of evictions spanning 3 states. You are a predator who walked right into a trap. You thought you were taking over a fortune, but all you did was legally bind yourself to my sister's massive inherited debt." The cheap lawyer finally stood up, zipping his briefcase shut with a loud tearing sound. He did not even look at his clients. He just muttered something about a conflict of interest and practically sprinted out of the conference room, leaving the 3 of them completely defenseless. Arthur watched him flee with a faint smirk, finally allowing himself a moment of amusement. My mother was trembling now, her previous rage completely evaporating into cold, hard panic. Her hands shook as she reached out, trying to grab the edge of the table for support. "Valerie, please," she whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "This is your home. This is your family. You cannot do this to us. Where are we supposed to go?" "You should have thought about that before you hired a bargain basement lawyer to accuse me of elder abuse," I replied calmly. "You tried to freeze my personal assets and destroy the corporate career that kept a roof over your head. You tried to send me to federal prison because you were too arrogant to realize who was actually pulling the strings behind the curtain. You called me ugly and difficult and told me my only purpose in this world was to serve you and Monique. Well, my service is officially over." I reached into the red folder one last time and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. It was an invoice heavily detailed and legally binding. I slid it across the smooth wood of the table, stopping right between Preston and Monique. "Since you two officially accepted the inheritance of this house in front of witnesses, you also accepted its liabilities," I stated, staring directly into Preston's terrified eyes. "You owe me $150,000 in back rent. You have 7 days to pay." The silence that followed my demand was so profound, it felt as though all the oxygen had been vacuumed directly out of the room. Preston's eyes remained locked on the crisp white paper of the invoice, staring at the black ink as if it were a physical death sentence. The absolute reality of his situation was finally sinking through his thick skull. He did not just fail to secure a multi-million-dollar estate, he had legally anchored himself to a family that was drowning in massive debt, and he now owed a small fortune to the one person in the room holding all the power. The veins in his neck began to pulse visibly against his skin. The cheap tailored suit he wore suddenly looked tight and suffocating as he struggled to process the magnitude of his own spectacular failure. He slowly turned his head to look at Monique. The charming, sophisticated mask he had worn since the day he first stepped into my mother's house began to crack and splinter, falling away to reveal the desperate, cornered predator underneath. He told her she lied to him, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He accused her of sitting in that massive house drinking champagne and playing the wealthy heiress when she had absolutely nothing to her name. Monique shrank back into her plush leather chair, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine fear. She had never seen this side of her perfect husband before. The man who brought her imported roses and whispered sweet promises into her ear was completely gone, replaced by someone cold and violently angry. She stammered that she did not know, her voice pitching upward into a desperate whine. She swore to him she thought the house was hers and that our mother had promised it to her. Preston slammed his fist against the mahogany table so hard that the heavy water glasses rattled, spilling cold water onto the polished wood. He roared at her not to play stupid, completely abandoning any pretense of mediation or professional decorum. He told her she trapped him. He sneered that she thought she could reel him in with her fake designer bags and her empty stories about generational wealth. He called her a massive liability and a walking debt. He admitted right there in front of everyone that he only married her because she was supposed to be his ticket out of his own financial ruin. But instead, she had just handed him a shovel to dig his own grave. The pure, vicious venom in his words echoed harshly off the glass walls of the corporate conference room. Monique burst into tears, and this time they were real. Her perfectly contoured face crumbled as the illusion of her perfect fairy tale marriage was violently ripped apart in front of an audience. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, seeking some kind of comfort, but he slapped it away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He leaned over her until she was pressed flat against the back of her chair and snarled that she was completely useless to him now. I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms and watching the absolute destruction of their alliance. This was the beautiful, inevitable result of building a life entirely on lies and manipulation. The moment the false foundation of money was removed, they turned on each other like starving wolves trapped in a cage. There was no love here, and there was certainly no familial loyalty. There was only transactional greed, and when the transaction failed, the greed instantly turned into raw hatred. My mother Yvonne finally snapped out of her shocked paralysis. But her reaction was perhaps the most pathetic display I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Instead of protecting her daughter from the grown man who was currently screaming in her face, Yvonne actually reached across the table and grabbed Preston's arm. She begged him to calm down, her voice trembling with absolute desperation. She pleaded with him not to leave Monique, promising him that they could fix this, and that they could somehow find a way to get the money he needed. She told Preston he was a good man and that he belonged in their family. She was actually begging him. My mother was begging a broke, desperate con artist with a massive bounty on his head to stay with her daughter simply because she could not bear the high society humiliation of a failed marriage. She cared infinitely more about maintaining the optical illusion of having a successful son-in-law than she cared about Monique's physical safety or basic dignity. It was the ultimate confirmation of everything I had always known about her. Her maternal love was nothing but a cheap performance, and her priorities were entirely tied to status and appearance. Preston spat at her to fix it, yanking his arm violently out of my mother's grasp. He demanded to know how exactly she was going to fix anything when she did not even own the chair she sat on at home. He called them both frauds. He paced back and forth behind his chair, running his hands frantically over his face, his breathing ragged and uneven. I could practically see him doing the mental math, calculating exactly how much time he had before the violent loan sharks caught up with him now that his easy escape plan was ruined. I glanced at Arthur, who was watching the scene with the detached, mild interest of a scientist observing an experiment run its natural course. I gave my lawyer a slight nod. We had accomplished exactly what we came here to do. There was no need to stay and watch the rest of the garbage fire burn itself out to the ashes. I calmly reached forward and gathered my red folder, placing it back into my structured leather briefcase. The metallic click of the brass locks seemed exceptionally loud in the room, temporarily breaking through the sound of Monique's sobbing and Yvonne's desperate, pathetic pleading. Preston stopped pacing and glared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. He told me I probably thought I had won his eyes dark and entirely empty. He warned me that I could not just drop this on them and walk away. He stepped toward my side of the table and stated that I did not know who I was dealing with. He said he had absolutely nothing left to lose, and that made him a very dangerous man. I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my tailored suit jacket. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calm certainty. I told him he was not dangerous. I said he was just a desperate man who ran out of other people's money to spend. I reminded him that the invoice was due in 7 days, and if the funds were not transferred into my accounts, I would begin formal eviction proceedings against all of them immediately. I wished them a wonderful afternoon and turned my back on the entire group. Without waiting for any further response, I walked toward the heavy oak door. Arthur followed closely behind me, his posture perfectly straight and professional. As we stepped out into the long carpeted corridor, the sound of Preston's screaming erupted once again, echoing through the heavy wood as he resumed tearing into my mother and sister. I did not look back. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, and with every step I took, I felt a heavy, suffocating weight lifting from my shoulders. The toxic psychological grip my family had held over me for 30 years was finally and entirely broken. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the mediation center and out into the bright, glaring sunlight of the financial district. The cool afternoon air felt incredibly fresh against my face. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet victory of total freedom. As I stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, a man in a nondescript gray jacket detached himself from the shadow of the building and fell into step beside me. It was Marcus, the private investigator I had retained months ago to track Preston's shady movements and offshore communications. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask how the mediation went. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and seamlessly passed a small silver flash drive into the palm of my hand without breaking his stride. I closed my fingers around the cool metal, feeling the sharp edges of the drive pressing into my skin. Marcus kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, watching the heavy flow of pedestrian traffic on the busy street. "Preston is making his move tonight," the private investigator said, his voice low and barely audible over the noise of the passing cars. I closed my hand around the cool metal of the flash drive, feeling the sharp edges press into my palm. Marcus did not slow his pace as he walked beside me down the busy financial district sidewalk. He kept his voice low and steady as he explained the exact details of the intelligence his surveillance team had gathered. They had intercepted a series of frantic digital communications between Preston and a known associate of a very dangerous Miami lending syndicate. Preston was completely out of time, and he was rapidly running out of options. The loan sharks had given him a strict 48-hour deadline to produce the cash he owed them, or they were going to start demonstrating their displeasure physically. Marcus told me that Preston had managed to procure a cloned master keycard for my secure residential high-rise. He was planning to bypass the front desk concierge and the building security while I was supposedly attending the annual Children's Hospital charity gala that evening. His desperate goal was to break into my luxury penthouse and locate my private home office. He wanted to steal the original physical copies of the promissory notes to destroy the evidence of his massive debt. Or at the very least, he planned to steal enough high-end jewelry and corporate cash to buy himself another week of breathing room from the people hunting him. I thanked Marcus for his excellent work and told him to coordinate directly with the local police precinct. There would be no charity gala for me tonight. The interior of my penthouse was draped in absolute suffocating darkness. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut across the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking out the glowing ambient light of the city skyline. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather armchair tucked into the darkest corner of my home office. The expensive crystal wine glass felt heavy and grounding in my hand. It was filled with a dark vintage Cabernet that I slowly swirled as I waited for the trap to spring. The silence in the sprawling apartment was absolute and heavy. I had dismissed my personal staff for the evening, and the only sound was the faint, steady hum of the central climate control system. It was nearing midnight when I finally heard the subtle electronic click of the front door lock disengaging. They were not quiet or stealthy. Preston was breathing heavily, his desperate panic making him clumsy and loud in the pristine space. I could hear his heavy footsteps scuffing carelessly against the polished hardwood floors of the grand foyer. Right behind him came the frantic, shuffling steps of my sister. Monique was actually sobbing quietly, her breath catching in her throat with every step she took into my home. I listened with cold, clinical detachment as Preston harshly whispered for her to shut up and keep moving. He was actively manipulating her, using her blind loyalty and her sheer terror to make her a willing accomplice in a major felony break-in. He told her that this was the absolute only way to save their family and their reputation. He hissed that if she did not help him find the corporate documents, they would both end up sleeping on the street or worse. The door to my home office slowly pushed open with a faint creak. The ambient security light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating their frantic silhouettes. Preston was sweating profusely, his expensive suit jacket discarded somewhere in the hallway, and his white dress shirt soaked through at the collar. Monique was shaking visibly, clutching a designer handbag against her chest, like a protective shield. She was ridiculously wearing expensive stilettos that clicked awkwardly and loudly as she stumbled into the dark room. Preston ignored her completely and lunged directly for my massive solid oak desk. He began pulling out drawers with violent force, tossing confidential client files and financial folders onto the floor in a frantic, desperate search. He was looking for the red folder he had seen at the mediation center earlier that afternoon. He was looking for the shadow loan agreements, the bankruptcy filings, and the deed to the estate. He muttered to himself, cursing my name over and over again as he ripped through my perfectly organized corporate documents. Monique stood near the doorway, crying openly, now tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. She begged him to stop and told him they needed to leave before the building security caught them. She pleaded with him, saying that this was a terrible mistake and that they were going to go to federal prison for breaking into my home. Preston spun around and grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. He snarled that there was no going back now and demanded she start checking the bookshelves for a hidden wall safe. The charming, sophisticated facade he had used to secure his wealthy bride was entirely gone, leaving only a violent predator who was backed into a corner. He told her she was useless and pathetic, and ordered her to start making herself useful by finding something valuable they could pawn. He turned back to the desk, pulling the heavy center drawer out so forcefully that it completely detached from the metal tracks and crashed heavily onto the floor. Papers scattered everywhere like falling snow. He dropped to his knees, grabbing blindly at the documents with shaking hands. The sheer pathetic desperation of his actions was almost sad to witness. But I felt no pity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the rich liquid slide down my throat. I reached over to the small table beside my chair and pressed the master switch on the smart remote. The overhead LED lights snapped on instantly, flooding the entire office with blinding, brilliant white light. Preston froze on the floor, his hands full of worthless stationery. Monique screamed and dropped her handbag, spilling cosmetics and keys across the carpet. I sat comfortably in my armchair, crossing my legs and resting the stem of the wine glass on my knee. I told them they were making a terrible mess of my office. Preston stared at me, his jaw hanging open in pure shock as he realized the charity gala was an elaborate trap. Before he could even attempt to stand up, 4 heavily armed police officers and 2 of my private corporate security guards stepped seamlessly out of the shadows of the adjacent hallway, their weapons drawn and focused directly on his chest. The heavy thud of the dropped papers echoed in the sudden tense silence of the office. Preston stood completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically between the barrels of the weapons pointed at him and the calm, unyielding expressions of the officers. For a split second, I saw his mind desperately trying to calculate a way out, trying to find a lie or an excuse that could explain away the broken desk drawer and the scattered corporate documents surrounding his feet. But there was no charm left to use. The lead officer, a tall, solidly built black man with a completely unforgiving stare, did not even give him a chance to speak. He moved forward with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "Put your hands behind your back!" the officer commanded, his voice booming through the room with absolute authority. Preston hesitated, his privileged entitlement momentarily overriding his basic survival instincts. "Do you know who I am?" he stammered, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of arrogance and fear. "I am a highly respected financial consultant. You cannot just barge in here and point guns at me." The officer did not care about his imaginary credentials. He grabbed Preston by the shoulder of his expensive silk shirt, spun him around roughly, and slammed him face first against the custom oak wood paneling of my office wall. The impact knocked the breath out of Preston's lungs with a loud, heavy grunt. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded like the final definitive end of his entire miserable charade. That was the exact moment the carefully constructed mask of the perfect, charming white savior completely disintegrated. Stripped of his control, stripped of his stolen wealth, and physically pinned against the wall by a man he viewed as completely beneath him, Preston absolutely lost his mind. The panic bubbling inside his chest instantly turned into pure, unadulterated venom. He started thrashing against the officer's grip, violently twisting his shoulders and kicking his legs like a petulant child throwing a vicious tantrum. "Take your filthy hands off me!" he screamed, his face turning a blotchy, terrifying shade of crimson. He looked back over his shoulder at the arresting officers, and the vile, racist vitriol began pouring out of his mouth like toxic sludge. He started screaming disgusting racial slurs, words so deeply bigoted and steeped in historical hatred that they seemed to rot the very air in the room. He spat insults at the black officers, demanding they bow down to him, screaming that his taxes paid their salaries, and that he would have them all fired and completely ruined by morning. He turned his manic, hate-filled eyes toward me and unleashed a torrent of racist abuse about my background, my family, and my heritage, telling me I was nothing but corporate trash who got lucky, and that I would never truly belong in his refined world. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. I let him scream. I let him show every single person in the room exactly what kind of monster he was hiding beneath his designer suits and fake gold watches. The officers did not even blink at his insults. They simply tightened their grip, pressing his cheek harder against the wood paneling, ignoring his bigoted rants with the professional detachment of men who handled garbage every single day. I shifted my gaze to Monique. My sister was pressed flat against the far wall of the office, trembling so violently that her knees looked ready to give out entirely. Her eyes were wide with absolute bottomless horror. This was the man she had proudly paraded around our family gatherings. This was the wealthy, sophisticated savior she had thrown in my face for 2 years, claiming he was going to elevate our family to new heights of high society and prestige. She had mocked my long hours of hard work. She had sold out her own sister and blindly followed this man into a felony break-in because she believed he was a superior, intelligent being who would give her the world. Now she was watching her perfect husband foam at the mouth, screaming vile racist slurs, and thrashing against a wall like a rabid animal. The grand illusion of her life was completely permanently shattered. Preston suddenly realized that his racist threats were doing absolutely nothing to stop the arrest or intimidate the officers. The stark reality of federal prison flooded back in, overwhelming his blind anger. He desperately needed a scapegoat. He twisted his neck to look at Monique, his eyes wild and completely devoid of any affection or loyalty. "It was her idea!" he shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. He pointed his cuffed hands toward Monique, practically spitting the words across the room. "She made me do it. She is crazy. She told me this was her house and that we needed to come get her documents. I did not want to come here. She is a lying, gold-digging parasite, and she dragged me into this mess. Arrest her. Take her to jail right now. She is the one you want." Monique let out a choked, agonizing sob. The man she had risked everything for, the man who promised her a life of endless luxury, was throwing her entirely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He was treating her like absolute dirt, offering her up to the police just to save his own miserable skin. Her hands flew to her mouth as she stared at him, the final pieces of her delusion shattering into dust on the floor alongside the scattered papers of my office. The lead officer pulled Preston back from the wall, turning him toward the door. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer began loudly cutting off Preston's frantic screaming. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Monique suddenly pushed herself off the wall and stumbled toward me, her expensive heels sinking into the ruined documents on the carpet. She fell to her knees right beside my armchair, her hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my suit trousers. Her face was a mess of running mascara and desperate, terrified tears. "Valerie, please," she begged, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical squeal. "Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it is just a family misunderstanding. We are sisters, Valerie. You cannot let them take us to prison. Please just tell the cops to let us go." I looked down at my sister, watching her weep and beg at my feet, just like our mother had begged earlier that day. I looked at Preston, still fighting against the officers near the doorway, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred and debilitating fear. I slowly reached forward and set my empty wine glass down on the edge of my broken desk. The sharp clink of the crystal against the wood silenced the entire room. I looked at my sister with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the deep ocean. Trespassing and attempted grand larceny. I stated, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. "Take him away." The officers dragged Preston out of my office, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping uselessly against the carpet as he continued to scream empty threats into the hallway. I watched them leave, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure settling over my chest. The silence that fell over my penthouse was absolute and deeply satisfying. Hours later, the sterile fluorescent lights of the downtown police precinct buzzed overhead with an annoying mechanical hum. It was 3 in the morning, and the air in the waiting area smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I sat perfectly composed on a hard plastic bench, waiting to finalize my formal statement for the lead detective. The heavy double doors of the precinct suddenly burst open violently, hitting the rubber wall stops. My mother, Yvonne, rushed in looking like a deranged hurricane. Her normally flawless, highlighted hair was a tangled, messy nest around her pale face, and she had clearly thrown her expensive mink coat haphazardly over a silk nightgown. Monique was curled up in a plastic chair in the far corner of the waiting room, sobbing so violently that her entire body shook. Her designer dress was ruined, covered in the dirt and grime from my office floor, where she had dropped her bag. My mother completely ignored her crying golden child. She did not even glance in Monique's direction or pause to see if her daughter was physically harmed. Instead, she made a beeline straight for me, her eyes wide and frantic with narcissistic panic. "Valerie, you have to stop this immediately," she demanded, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet precinct and drawing the annoyed stares of 2 passing officers. She stood over me, her hands trembling as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. She told me I was going to march right back into the interrogation room and tell the police I made a massive mistake. She ordered me to drop the ridiculous charges against Preston right that very second. I looked up at her, calmly smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the fabric of my trousers. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked her why on earth I would ever do that when her precious son-in-law had broken into my private property and actively tried to steal from me. My mother gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her chest, as if my completely logical question was the most offensive thing she had ever heard in her life. She told me I was destroying the family reputation in the community. She hissed that the women at the social club would exile them forever if word got out that her daughter's husband was arrested and booked like a common street criminal. She leaned in close, her face contorted with pure, desperate malice, and threatened to curse my name until the day she died. She told me I was a bitter, ugly woman who was maliciously destroying my sister's perfect marriage just out of pure, blinding jealousy. I slowly reached into my leather briefcase, which rested neatly beside me on the bench. I pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out toward her. "I am not destroying her marriage, Mom," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the cold air of the precinct. "Preston's incredibly violent loan sharks are doing that all by themselves. I watched her snatch the envelope from my hand, her eyes darting nervously down to the thick paper inside. "And by the way, Mom," I added, leaning back against the uncomfortable plastic chair and looking her dead in the eye. "Here is your official 24-hour eviction notice. The county sheriff will be at the estate tomorrow at exactly 12 noon to ensure you have entirely vacated my property." My mother stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade, her mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and walked past her toward the exit, leaving her standing completely frozen in the middle of the police station. The sun began to rise, painting the early morning sky in pale, beautiful shades of gray and pink, by the time Yvonne and Monique finally made it back to the massive estate. I had hired a private security detail to sit parked outside the iron gates to monitor their exit, making sure they did not try to illegally strip the house of its valuable fixtures on their way out. Through the detailed updates from my security team, I knew exactly what was happening inside those lavish walls as dawn broke over the sprawling property. Inside the massive mansion, absolute chaos had erupted. Yvonne and Monique were sprinting desperately from room to room, frantically stuffing 30 years of hoarded luxury goods into heavy black plastic trash bags. The indignity of the situation was poetic. Expensive silk scarves, designer handbags, custom velvet throw pillows, and cashmere blankets were being carelessly shoved into the bags like worthless garbage. The grand illusion of their high society life was literally being packed into refuse bags as they scrambled to salvage whatever status symbols they could carry. But my mother was still clinging desperately to her arrogant delusions, even as the harsh reality of her eviction was staring her right in the face. She was storming through the grand marble hallway, shouting at Monique to pack faster. She told her crying, traumatized daughter that they were going to be perfectly fine. She yelled that they did not need my dirty money, and they certainly did not need this house anymore to maintain their status. She bragged loudly, her voice bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings, that she had a secret $300,000 retirement trust that my dead father Jerome had set up specifically for her. She laughed a sharp, hysterical sound bordering on actual madness, and claimed it was a highly secure offshore account that her terrible, ungrateful workhorse of a daughter Valerie had absolutely no idea about and could never legally touch. Monique was standing in the formal dining room holding a heavy imported crystal vase she had just pulled from the display cabinet. At the loud, arrogant mention of the secret trust fund, she froze completely. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost in the pale early morning light. Her hands began to shake so violently that she could no longer grip the smooth, heavy glass of the vase. The expensive crystal slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the imported hardwood floor with a deafening violent crash, sending sparkling sharp shards flying in every direction. Yvonne stopped packing immediately and glared at her daughter, demanding to know what was wrong with her and why she was being so clumsy when they were running out of time. But Monique could not speak. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She simply stared down at the broken crystal, refusing to look her mother in the eye. The heavy, suffocating silence in the dining room suddenly told the entire miserable story. Monique was shaking uncontrollably because she knew the absolute truth. There was no secret retirement trust left to save them from ruin. The spoiled golden child had secretly drained her mother's hidden lifeline months ago, desperately transferring every single cent to dangerous men, trying to pay off Preston's shadow debts. The agonizing hours between that shattered crystal vase and the stroke of noon felt like a slow-moving execution for my mother and sister. Yvonne completely misinterpreted Monique's silent, trembling terror, assuming her golden child was simply overwhelmed by the stress of packing their luxurious life into heavy black trash bags. She patted Monique's cheek and promised her again and again that Jerome's secret $300,000 trust would save them all. She talked endlessly about how they would rent a luxury suite downtown while their lawyers tore me apart in court. Monique just stared at the floor, her throat completely locked tight with the toxic secret she was too terrified to confess. She remembered the exact night Preston had forced her to log into that hidden account, transferring every single cent to his offshore loan sharks to buy his own life. She knew they were entirely destitute, but she could not bring herself to shatter her mother's final delusion. At exactly 12 o'clock, the quiet serenity of the upscale suburban neighborhood was violently shattered. The heavy grinding rumble of two massive commercial moving trucks echoed down the pristine, manicured street, their air brakes hissing loudly as they parked in front of the estate. Right behind them were three county sheriff cruisers, their lights flashing brightly in the midday sun, painting the expensive white pillars of the house in harsh strokes of red and blue. The heavy doors of the cruisers slammed shut as stern-faced deputies stepped out onto the driveway, their utility belts jingling as they approached the front door, gripping clipboards and formal eviction orders. The commotion was impossible to ignore. Up and down the exclusive street, the heavy mahogany doors of the neighboring mansions began to open. The wealthy country club wives that my mother had spent decades trying to impress stepped out onto their perfectly trimmed lawns. The president of the Homeowners Association and the ladies from the charity board gathered in small groups, holding their expensive coffee cups and whispering behind their manicured hands. They watched with greedy fascination as the absolute destruction of Yvonne's carefully curated high society image unfolded right in front of them. I arrived 10 minutes later. My sleek black town car glided silently up to the curb, parking right behind the line of police cruisers. My driver opened the door, and I stepped out into the warm afternoon air, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that projected nothing but cold, absolute authority. I did not cross the property line to engage with the chaos. I simply stood behind the yellow tape the deputies were stringing across the wide driveway, folding my hands in front of me and watching the inevitable consequences of my mother's greed finally come to collect their due. The heavy front doors of the estate were thrown wide open by the deputies, and the moving crew began their ruthless, efficient work. It was a spectacular visual dismantling of 30 years of unearned arrogance. The men hauled out the heavy black trash bags bulging with crumpled designer dresses and shoved them unceremoniously onto the front lawn. Next came the gaudy velvet armchairs, the imported rugs, and the expensive oil paintings my mother had bought with money she had siphoned from my father's business. Racks of expensive shoes and boxes of fine china were dumped directly onto the grass like worthless junk meant for a neighborhood yard sale. Yvonne came running out of the house, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hysteria. She was waving her arms wildly at the massive movers, screaming at them not to touch her priceless antiques, and threatening to sue them for every scratch. When she saw the neighbors standing on the sidewalks, watching her public humiliation, the last remaining shreds of her sanity completely evaporated. She frantically tried to smooth down her messy, unbrushed hair and fix her ruined silk clothes, attempting to project dignity. But it was entirely useless. She looked exactly like what she had always been, a desperate fraud clinging to a stolen lifestyle. She tried to wave at the neighbors, calling out to them that there had been a terrible banking error, but they all looked away, pretending not to hear her. Then her frantic, wild eyes locked onto me standing calmly by my town car. The sheer venom that contorted her features was almost demonic. She pushed past a deputy and charged down the driveway, her expensive heels snapping aggressively against the concrete. An officer stepped directly into her path, holding out a firm, rigid hand to stop her from crossing the police line and reaching me. She slammed against the invisible barrier of the law and began screaming at the top of her lungs, ensuring every single neighbor heard her vicious words. She called me a heartless monster and a sociopath. She shrieked that I was an unnatural daughter who was violently throwing her own flesh and blood out onto the street out of pure malicious jealousy. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I had always hated Monique and that I was trying to destroy them because I could never be as beautiful or as loved as her precious golden child. She told the watching crowd that I was a corporate vulture who was stealing my own mother's home. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against her pathetic public tantrum. I simply watched her sweat and scream, observing her total loss of control with profound, quiet satisfaction. The louder she yelled, the more unhinged she looked to the very society she worshipped. Yvonne realized her insults were bouncing right off my armor, so she pivoted to her final delusional threat. She puffed out her chest and announced to me and the entire neighborhood that I had not won anything at all. She screamed that Jerome had left her a secret offshore retirement trust containing $300,000 and that she was going to use every single penny of it to hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the country. She promised to drag me through federal court, destroy my career, and take back her precious estate. She laughed a high-crazed sound and told me my little eviction stunt was completely pointless because her hidden fortune made her completely untouchable. Monique had stumbled out onto the front porch during this deranged speech. She was leaning heavily against the grand stone pillar, looking like she was going to violently throw up right on the marble steps. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she was entirely powerless to stop the incoming collision with reality. I uncrossed my arms and slowly walked right up to the edge of the police line, stopping mere inches from where my mother was restrained by the officer. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and extracted a single crisp piece of paper folded neatly in thirds. I held it out, offering it directly to her trembling hand. She snatched it from my fingers, her eyes blazing with triumphant arrogance, actually believing I was handing her some kind of legal surrender or a settlement offer. She unfolded the paper aggressively and stared down at the black ink. It was a certified bank statement from the exact offshore trust account she was just screaming about to the entire street. I watched the arrogant sneer on her face completely freeze in real time. Her eyes darted frantically across the rows of printed numbers, trying to process the bleak financial reality printed on the page. The detailed list showed massive wire transfers going to anonymous shell accounts, leaving the final balance at absolute zero. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my voice was low enough that only she and Monique could hear the final devastating truth. "What $300,000 fund, Mom?" I asked, my tone dripping with absolute glacial finality. "Read page 2. My mother stared down at the crisp white paper fluttering slightly in the warm afternoon breeze. Her eyes tracked across the neat rows of black ink, trying to comprehend the impossible numbers printed before her. I watched her lips move silently as she read the dates of the transactions. 5 weeks ago. Her voice was barely a whisper when the words finally escaped her throat. She read the exact date out loud. It was the very same day that Monique and Preston had arrived at the estate, with their designer luggage claiming their luxury townhouse was undergoing emergency renovations, and they needed a temporary place to stay. The bank statement told a completely different story. It showed a rapid succession of massive wire transfers, draining the account completely dry in a matter of hours. $50,000, $100,000, all routed to anonymous offshore holding accounts that were utterly untraceable. Yvonne flipped to the final page of the document, her hands shaking so violently the paper crinkled loudly in the quiet air. She stared at the authorization signature line. It was not her handwriting. It was the looping, elegant cursive of her precious youngest daughter. Monique had used the sweeping emergency power of attorney that Yvonne had blindly and foolishly granted her years ago. Monique had used her ultimate golden child access to bypass every single security measure the bank had in place. I stood perfectly still behind the yellow police tape, watching the exact moment my mother's entire universe collapsed in on itself. The offshore trust fund she had guarded so fiercely for years was gone. The stolen money she had relied on to fund her arrogance and shield her from consequence had vanished into thin air. And it had not been taken by me or the IRS or some nameless corporate entity. It had been stolen by the very daughter she worshipped. Monique had robbed her own mother blind to pay off a fraction of her criminal husband's dangerous debts. Yvonne slowly lowered the paper. The manic, frantic energy that had possessed her just moments ago completely vanished, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying stillness. She slowly turned her head to look at Monique. Monique was still backed up against the grand marble pillar of the front porch, her knees trembling so violently She looked ready to collapse right there on the stone steps. Tears were streaming down Monique's face, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her silk blouse. The heavy, suffocating silence on the lawn was absolute. Even the moving crew paused their heavy lifting to watch the spectacular implosion of this miserable family. "You did this," Yvonne whispered, her voice cracking and raw, sounding like broken glass. "You took my money. You took my future. You took everything I had left." Monique let out a pathetic, choking sob and shook her head back and forth, trying desperately to formulate a lie. But there were no lies left to tell. The absolute truth was printed right there in black and white in her mother's trembling hands. "Preston made me do it," Monique wailed, her voice echoing across the silent, manicured lawn. "He said they were going to kill him, Mom. He said he needed the money to keep us safe. I was going to put it back. I promise I was going to put it all back." The pathetic, cowardly confession hung in the warm afternoon air. Yvonne stared at her favorite child, the daughter she had sacrificed absolutely everything for. She had treated me like complete garbage my entire life, just to elevate Monique. She had turned a blind eye to every single one of Monique's selfish flaws. She had funded her lavish lifestyle, covered up her endless mistakes, and alienated her only responsible daughter, all in the name of protecting her perfect golden child. And this was her ultimate reward: total, absolute, soul-crushing betrayal. The daughter she worshipped had sold her out to save a manipulative criminal. A primal, guttural scream suddenly ripped from my mother's throat. It was not a scream of sadness, but a roar of pure, unhinged, violent rage. The bank statement fluttered to the grass as Yvonne lunged forward. She cleared the distance between the driveway and the porch in seconds, throwing herself at Monique like a feral animal. Her hands curled into vicious claws as she tackled her golden child, sending them both crashing down off the marble steps and into the manicured shrubbery. Yvonne grabbed a massive handful of Monique's highlighted hair and pulled violently, screaming that she had ruined her life. Monique shrieked in pain, raising her arms to protect her face, as her mother rained heavy, uncoordinated blows down upon her shoulders and chest. "You stole from me!" Yvonne shrieked, spittle flying from her lips as she thrashed in the dirt. "You ungrateful little parasite, I gave you everything and you left me with nothing." They rolled across the expensive landscaping, crushing the imported orchids and tearing up the pristine black mulch. Their expensive designer clothes ripped and stained with mud as they fought like wild dogs on the front lawn. The watching neighbors gasped in collective horror, stepping back from the property line as the two women tore at each other in the dirt. The wealthy country club wives covered their mouths, watching the final spectacular destruction of Yvonne's high society masquerade. The sheriff deputies immediately sprang into action, breaking the police line and rushing up the lawn. Their heavy boots trampled over the scattered designer bags and velvet pillows as they sprinted toward the fighting women. It took 2 large officers to physically pry my mother off her golden child. Yvonne thrashed wildly against the deputies, grips her dress torn and stained with dirt and crushed flower petals. She kicked her legs and screamed vile curses at the daughter she had once adored. Monique lay sobbing in the ruined flower bed, her face scratched and her perfect hair a tangled, messy disaster. The deputies dragged Yvonne back toward the street, warning her loudly that she would be arrested for criminal assault if she did not stop fighting them. But Yvonne could not calm down. She was completely, permanently broken. She slumped against the cold metal side of a police cruiser, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her total destitution finally crushed her spirit. The money was gone. The house was gone. The perfect daughter was a thief. The toxic bond between the golden child and the narcissistic mother was permanently shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I stood silently by my town car, watching the moving crew resume their work, dumping the last of their belongings onto the grass. There were no more secrets left to hide behind. The eviction was complete in every possible way. I turned away from the pathetic scene, opening the heavy door of my town car and sliding into the cool, quiet leather interior. My revenge was absolute, and my life was finally entirely my own. I settled back into the plush leather seat of the town car, the cool air conditioning washing over me like a cleansing wave. Outside the heavy tinted windows, the chaotic symphony of my mother's hysterical screaming and the loud authoritative shouts of the sheriff deputies became muffled and distant. "Drive, please," I said to my chauffeur, my voice calm and completely free of any hesitation. The heavy luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the sprawling estate and the shattered remains of my biological family entirely behind me. I did not turn my head to look out the rear window. I did not need a final glimpse of Yvonne and Monique being pried apart by law enforcement on the ruined front lawn, surrounded by piles of discarded designer garbage. The grand illusion they had sold their souls to maintain was permanently demolished, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, quiet liberation taking root deep inside my chest. The toxic chains of obligation, guilt, and unrequited love that had bound me to those people for 35 years were finally permanently severed. 2 weeks passed, and the transition was like stepping out of a dark, suffocating cave into the warm, bright sunlight. The relentless noise and manipulation that had always hovered at the edges of my life were replaced by a beautiful, productive silence. Without the constant drain of my mother's demands and my sister's manufactured crises, my business flourished even more rapidly. My mind was clear, my energy was boundless, and the space in my heart that had once harbored a desperate, pathetic hope for a mother's love was now filled with genuine respect for the life I had built entirely on my own. It was a Thursday evening, and I was hosting a private dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The room was bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers, and the long mahogany table was covered in fresh white orchids and flickering candles. I sat at the head of the table, but this was not a gathering dictated by hierarchy or control, like the miserable, tense family dinners of my past. The women seated around me were my top clients, my mentors, and my closest colleagues. They were brilliant, ambitious, self-made women who understood the value of hard work and authentic connection. They were my chosen family. We shared stories of our early struggles. We laughed loudly at our past mistakes, and we celebrated our current victories with genuine, unjealous joy. There was no performative bragging, no subtle put-downs, no desperate scrambling for the spotlight. It was simply a gathering of powerful women lifting each other up. Looking around the table, listening to the rich sound of their laughter, blending with the soft clinking of crystal glasses, I felt a radiant, glowing sense of belonging that I had never once experienced in my mother's house. I was thriving, completely grounded in my own power, and surrounded by people who respected me for exactly who I was. The exquisite multi-course dinner had just concluded, and the waiters were quietly pouring vintage champagne for the final toast. The atmosphere was warm and perfectly relaxed. Right at that moment, my phone, which was resting face up next to my water glass, buzzed with a sudden harsh vibration. The screen illuminated, cutting through the soft candlelight. I glanced down, my eyes catching the name flashing on the screen. It was Yvonne. I had not blocked her number yet, simply out of a lingering, practical curiosity about the legal fallout of the eviction, but I had not spoken a single word to her since that day on the lawn. I looked at the preview of the message. It was a massive, desperate wall of text practically dripping with pathetic, groveling panic. "Valerie, please, you have to help me." The message began, the frantic tone practically audible through the screen. "I have nowhere else to go. They took everything. I am staying in a disgusting cheap motel and the money is completely gone. Monique is a monster, Valerie. She is evil. She ruined my life and left me with absolutely nothing. She stole from her own mother. You were always the good daughter, Valerie. You were always the smart one, the reliable one. I always knew you were the best of us deep down. Please let me come stay at your penthouse just for a few weeks until I get on my feet. You are my daughter and I am your mother. We are family, and family has to help each other. Please, Valerie, I am begging you." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the desperate manipulative words. A year ago, or even 6 months ago, a message like this might have triggered a massive internal conflict. The ingrained childhood conditioning would have whispered that I owed her something, that turning away a begging mother was unnatural and cruel. I would have felt guilty for my own success while she suffered. But reading those words now, I felt completely and utterly detached. There was no pity in my heart for the woman who had happily thrown me under the bus for decades. She was not apologizing for a lifetime of abuse and neglect. She was not expressing genuine remorse for participating in a felony break-in to steal my hard-earned assets. She was simply doing what she had always done. She was looking for a new host to drain because her golden child had finally bled her dry. She was attempting to play the mother card only after every other single option had been completely exhausted and destroyed. The sheer audacity of her trying to rewrite history, claiming I was always the good daughter, was almost comical. I did not type out a response. I did not tell her how pathetic it was that she was suddenly trying to praise my reliability only when she needed a place to sleep. I did not remind her that she had called me a heartless monster just 14 days ago. Engaging with her toxic cycle would only give her the attention she was so desperately craving. The absolute greatest punishment for a narcissist is total absolute indifference. I reached forward with a calm, steady hand and picked up my phone. I tapped the screen, opening her contact profile. Without a single second of hesitation or a single ounce of regret, I pressed the button to permanently block her number. I watched her contact information vanish from my screen, cutting off her access to my life forever. I placed the phone face down on the crisp white tablecloth, silencing the past for good. The waiter finished pouring the champagne, stepping back from the table. I reached out and picked up the delicate crystal flute, the pale gold liquid sparkling beautifully in the candlelight. I stood up, the soft rustle of my silk dress drawing the attention of the incredible women seated around me. The conversations faded as they turned to look at me, their faces reflecting genuine warmth and respect. I looked at these women who had supported my vision, who had challenged me to grow, and who celebrated my success as if it were their own. I smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I raised my glass high in the air, the crystal catching the light like a diamond. To new beginnings, I said, my voice clear and ringing with absolute peace, and to the family we choose. The women smiled and raised their glasses in unison, the melodic chime of crystal ringing out through the elegant dining room. I took a slow sip of the vintage champagne, letting the crisp, bright taste wash over my tongue. My past was finally entirely behind me, and my beautiful, peaceful life was just beginning. The warm light of the dining room seemed to wrap around me as the rest of the world simply faded to black. The greatest lesson from this story is that true security never comes from toxic family loyalty or stolen wealth. It comes from building your own independence and having the absolute courage to walk away from people who only value you for what they can take from you. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you owe absolutely nothing to those who constantly manipulate your kindness. True family is built on genuine respect, not endless exploitation. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relative to protect your own peace? Share your experience in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more stories about claiming your own power and rewriting your future.